Pay attention to the hands, not the man in the bed, not yet. Pay attention to the hands of the person leaning over him. Watch the way they move across the surface of the examination table. Too practiced, too deliberate, like someone who has done this exact motion hundreds of times and knows exactly how long to hold it before stepping back. This footage was captured on a home video camera. The person holding it was not supposed to be in that room. They had 11 minutes before the man who owned the house would return from a supply run. They used every one of those 11 minutes. And what they recorded in that dim, closed-off back bedroom of a house on a quiet residential street would become the single most important piece of evidence in a case that investigators would later describe as one of the most calculated forms of human captivity they had ever encountered. The man in the bed hadn't left that room in 7 years. He didn't know there were cameras in the house. He didn't know that the person who controlled every single aspect of his daily existence, every meal, every medication, every visitor, every phone call, had been systematically dismantling his life from the inside out. He thought he was being cared for, he was being imprisoned, and the person who finally picked up a camera and walked into that room was the only reason he got out alive. You know that feeling when you drive past a house every single day and you never once think about what's happening inside it? For the residents of Calloway Street in Millhaven, Ohio, that was the house at number 41. Modest, 2-story, a small front porch that someone had painted and never repainted, so the color had faded to something between gray and whatever it used to be. A car in the driveway, sometimes 2, curtains always closed, the kind of house you stop noticing after a while. That's the thing about isolation as a crime. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't have a broken window or a smell that drifts into the street. It happens quietly, behind curtains, in a room at the back of a house where nobody thinks to look, and by the time anyone does look, years have passed and the person inside has no way left to ask for help. Aldous Fenwick had lived on Calloway Street since 1989. He and his wife, Rosemary, had bought the house when interest rates were high, and the neighborhood was the kind of place young working couples moved to when they were being practical and optimistic at the same time. Aldous worked for a regional freight company, first as a driver, then in dispatch, then in logistics management. He was organized and reliable. Rosemary worked part-time at a dental office and grew tomatoes in the backyard every summer, more tomatoes than 2 people could possibly eat, which was fine because she gave most of them away. They were ordinary people living an ordinary life, not in a diminishing way, in the way that means they were real and they were content and the world around them worked more or less as it was supposed to. Aldous was the kind of person who remembered birthdays and showed up early and didn't need to be the most interesting person in the room. Rosemary ran a small book exchange from the front porch every summer, a cardboard box with a hand-lettered sign that said, "Take one, leave one," and had an opinion about everything and shared it without apology. Neighbors remembered them as a unit. The Fenwicks, the people who always had extra tomatoes, the people whose porch light was always on if you needed something at an inconvenient hour. The kind of couple whose stability feels, from a distance, like its own quiet form of generosity. And then, in the spring of 2001, Rosemary Fenwick was diagnosed with an aggressive form of ovarian cancer. She died 14 months later, in July of 2002. She was 54 years old. Aldous was 56. He had no children. His closest relatives were a sister in Phoenix and a cousin in Ontario, both of whom he spoke to infrequently, both of whom, when they later reflected on the years that followed Rosemary's death, would describe the same gradual pattern. Calls that came less often, letters that went unanswered, and finally a voice on the phone that sounded distant in a way they couldn't quite name, but didn't push. They didn't push. They should have, but they didn't, and that's not a condemnation. It's just what happens sometimes when grief builds a wall and the person on the other side stops asking you to climb over it. By 2003, Dressler Vane was the only person who regularly set foot inside 41 Calloway Street, and Dressler Vane was the last person on Earth Aldous Fenwick should have trusted. The arrival of Dressler Vane. Dressler Vane appeared in Aldous Fenwick's life at the exact moment a person in grief is most vulnerable to someone presenting themselves as a solution. He had known Rosemary. That part was real. He had been a peripheral figure at the freight company where Aldous worked, a contractor who ran equipment maintenance routes, the kind of person you see in the break room and know by face but not by much else. After Rosemary was diagnosed, Vane had begun showing up with small gestures, a casserole left on the porch, a card, an offer to mow the lawn when Aldous was spending his days at the hospital. Nothing dramatic, nothing that announced itself as calculated. People who knew Vane from that period described him consistently. Quiet, helpful, seemed to know when to appear and when to stay back. He had a gift for it, one former colleague later told investigators. Reading a room, reading a person, knowing what they needed before they said it out loud. The colleague paused. I used to think that was a quality. I don't think that anymore. After Rosemary died, Vane offered to stay on, help with the house, help with the errands. Just for a while, he said, just until Aldous found his footing again. Aldous, who was grieving and exhausted and suddenly living alone in a house that had been built for two people, said yes. He moved a bag of clothes into the spare room in September of 2002. He was still there when welfare officers arrived in February of 2009. The deterioration of Aldous Fenwick's physical condition between 2002 and 2009 was so dramatic that when investigators later reviewed his medical records from before Rosemary's illness, routine checkups, a knee surgery, a blood pressure prescription, they struggled to reconcile what they were reading with what they found when they entered the house on Calloway Street. In 2001, Aldous Fenwick weighed 214 pounds. He was a large man naturally, broad-shouldered, the kind of build that comes from years of physical work followed by years of desk work, not thin, but mobile, active. When welfare officers entered the back bedroom of 41 Calloway Street on February 11, 2009, they found a man who weighed an estimated 890 pounds, unable to sit upright, unable to move from the reinforced bed that occupied most of the room, his skin presenting with multiple pressure sores in various stages of severity, and a level of general physical deterioration that the first paramedic on scene later said she had never encountered outside of a textbook. 890 pounds. In 7 years. The medical literature on extreme weight gain of that nature is fairly clear. It doesn't happen passively. It doesn't happen by accident. To reach that weight in that time frame requires a consistent and extraordinary caloric surplus maintained over years. The body doesn't accumulate weight at that rate on its own. It requires effort. It requires feeding. What investigators would eventually establish through dietary logs and grocery receipts and the testimony of a nurse who had briefly worked in the house was that Dressler Vane had been feeding Aldous Fenwick between 12,000 and 15,000 calories per day, systematically, deliberately, with the same methodical precision he applied to everything else. He had turned a grieving man's body into a cage. Here's the thing about what Vane did that makes it different from other cases of financial exploitation or elder abuse. Most financial abusers isolate their victims socially. They cut off outside contact, intercept mail, monitor phone calls. Vane did all of that. But he added a dimension that the prosecutors in his eventual trial would describe as uniquely terrifying. He made Aldous physically unable to leave. Not through restraints, not through locked doors, through weight, through the progressive accumulation of mass that, by 2005, had made it impossible for Aldous to stand unassisted. By 2006, he could not sit upright without help. By 2007, the bedroom door had been widened and the standard bed replaced with a reinforced platform bed because nothing commercially available could support his weight. By 2008, Aldous Fenwick was as effectively imprisoned as if there had been iron bars on the window. There weren't. There didn't need to be. And Vane had positioned himself as the solution to the very problem he had created. He was the caregiver. He was the one who brought food, administered the medications Aldous increasingly needed for the health conditions accumulating alongside his weight, handled communications with the outside world, managed the finances. He was indispensable. He had engineered his own indispensability with the patience and foresight of someone who had been planning this for a very long time. The isolation was managed through layers, Mail was intercepted at the box before Aldous could see it. The landline in the bedroom was moved, as previously noted, inch by inch over months until it was out of reach. Visitors were discouraged through a combination of plausible medical excuses and the simple social awkwardness most people feel about pressing to see someone they've been told is unwell. Vane never forbade visitors outright. He simply made it clear through tone and phrasing and the timing of his responses that a visit would be an imposition on a fragile man. Most people backed away without being pushed. The few people who did manage contact with the outside world. A social worker who called in 2005 to check on a disability application, a representative from Aldis's former employer who had tried to reach him about a pension paperwork issue, were handled entirely by Vane. He was fluent in the bureaucratic language of medical complexity and caregiving burden. He knew exactly what to say to close a line of inquiry without raising flags. "I'll have him call you back when he's having a better day." Nobody ever followed up. Neighbors who occasionally saw Vane outside the house described someone who carried the quiet dignity of a person sacrificing for others. He accepted sympathy graciously. He spoke about Aldous with what sounded like genuine affection and sadness. "It's a terrible thing," he told a neighbor who asked after Aldous in 2006. "He's declined so much. I can't imagine putting him through the ordeal of the outside world at this point. The best I can do is make sure he's comfortable and not alone." The neighbor, who told this to investigators years later, said she had gone home and felt sorry for Dressler Vane. That was exactly what he wanted. While Aldous Fenwick's body was being systematically transformed into a mechanism of captivity, Dressler Vane was building something else entirely, a financial structure that would strip the Fenwick estate down to almost nothing. Aldous had not been a wealthy man, but he had been a careful one. The house on Calloway Street was paid off. He had a modest retirement account from his years at the freight company, a savings account, and 2 small investment properties he and Rosemary had purchased in the 90s, a rental duplex 2 miles away, and a commercial unit that had been leased to a dry cleaning business for 11 years. Together, these assets represented roughly $480,000 in equity and liquid savings at the time of Rosemary's death. By the time investigators began auditing the Fenwick finances in 2009, that number was $12,700. The mechanism through which Vane had achieved this was a power of attorney document signed in March of 2003, 9 months after Rosemary's death, when Aldous was already largely housebound and dependent. The notary who witnessed the signing, a man named Gerald Holt, who operated a small notary service from a strip mall on the edge of town, was interviewed by investigators and described the signing session as unusual. Aldous, he said, had appeared drowsy. He had not asked any questions about the document. He had signed where indicated without reading anything. Holt had raised this with Vane at the time. Vane had explained that Aldous was on new medication and tended to be tired in the afternoons. Holt had accepted this explanation. When later asked by investigators whether he had verified that the signatory understood what he was signing, Holt was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I should have. I know that now." Armed with power of attorney, Vane liquidated the retirement account in 2 tranches in 2003 and 2004, routing the funds through a business account he had established under a sole proprietorship called Vane Residential Care Services, a company with no employees, no registered clients, and no operating history beyond the name. The investment properties were sold in 2005 and 2006, again with the proceeds routed through the same account. Aldis's disability payments, which he had begun receiving in 2004 after his declining health made any form of employment impossible, went directly to the same account from the day of the first deposit. Vane paid himself what investigators would later calculate as approximately $340,000 over 6 years, in a pattern of regular withdrawals designed to stay beneath the reporting thresholds that would have triggered automatic bank scrutiny. He was, the forensic accountant who testified at trial would say, not a sophisticated financial criminal in the technical sense, but an extremely patient and methodical one. He understood that the easiest way to steal a large amount of money is to steal small amounts of it for a very long time. The residents of Calloway Street were not incurious people. Several of them, when interviewed during the investigation, expressed variations of the same sentiment. Something had always felt slightly off about number 41, but they had never been able to point to anything specific. Margaret Holloway, who lived directly across the street, told investigators that she had not seen Aldous Fenwick in person since approximately 2004. She had assumed he was unwell and that Vane was managing his care. She had once, in the spring of 2007, walked across the street and knocked on the front door to ask if there was anything she could do. Vane had answered, thanked her, and told her Aldous was sleeping and didn't like to be disturbed but would appreciate knowing she'd asked. He'd closed the door. She'd never knocked again. A mail carrier on the route said that all of the mail addressed to Aldous Fenwick, statements, notices, personal correspondence, was collected from the box by Vane. He had once seen Aldous, he thought, in a window on the upper floor, but only once, and the curtain had been drawn immediately. The couple 2 houses down, the Pattersons, had a clearer memory. In the summer of 2005, they had heard what sounded like a man calling out from the back of the house. Not screaming, just calling out. They had waited to see if it continued. It hadn't. They had decided it was the television. It wasn't the television. In September of 2008, Dressler Vane made the closest thing to a mistake he had made in 6 years. He hired a home nurse. Her name was Mirabelle Osuji. She was 31 years old, trained as a licensed practical nurse, and had been working through a home care agency for 4 years. She was assigned to 41 Calloway Street to provide supplementary overnight care. Vane had told the agency that he was managing a family member with complex care needs and that he needed overnight coverage twice a week so he could rest. She showed up for her first shift on September 14, 2008. Vane met her at the door, gave her a brief orientation, showed her the medication schedule posted on a clipboard on the wall, and left. Mirabelle Osuji had been a nurse long enough to know the difference between a room that had been cleaned for a visit and a room that was actually clean. The bedroom was in the first category. She also knew the difference between a patient whose condition was the result of natural disease progression and a patient whose condition had been shaped by external management of their diet and environment. That distinction, which she could not immediately articulate but which registered as a professional instinct within the first hour of her first shift, was what set everything that followed in motion. She observed Aldous Fenwick for 2 full overnight shifts before she said anything to anyone. She reviewed the medication schedule. She documented in her own private notes the food she saw delivered to the room during the times Vane was present. She asked Aldous carefully and during a moment when she was certain Vane was not in the house, whether he was comfortable, whether there was anything he wanted her to know. What she noticed, even before that conversation, were the things that didn't add up medically. The quantity of food being brought into the room was excessive for any standard care protocol. The medication schedule showed 2 additions in the preceding 6 months that, when she looked them up later, had sedative properties as secondary effects, not their primary function, which was pain management, but a known secondary. The room itself had been arranged in a way that minimized Aldous's ability to interact with anything independently. The remote control for the television bolted to a holder at an awkward angle, the water on the side table in a cup, with a lid that required fine motor control he no longer had easily. The light switch on the wall behind the door rather than beside the bed where any sensible person would have put it. None of these things were conclusive individually. Together, they told a story. What Aldous told her in that conversation was not, initially, a dramatic revelation. It was quieter than that. He said he sometimes felt confused, that he thought his medication had changed recently, but he wasn't sure, that he had wanted to call his sister for a long time, but Vane had said the phone was broken, that he couldn't remember the last time anyone other than Dressler had been in the room. Mirabelle Osuji went home after that second shift and sat at her kitchen table and thought about what she was going to do. She was a contract employee. The agency might not believe her. Vane had been nothing but polite to her. She had no proof of anything. She had professional observations and a conversation with a man who couldn't leave his bed. She thought about the cup with the lid. She thought about the light switch behind the door. She thought about the expression on Aldous Fenwick's face when she had said goodnight at the end of her first shift. Not the expression of a man who felt safe being left alone, but the expression of a man preparing himself for something he had no power to prevent. She decided it was enough. She needed one more thing first. She went back. Mirabelle Osuji's third shift on September 28, 2008, was a Sunday. She arrived at the scheduled time. Vane let her in and told her he needed to go out for supplies. He expected to be back within 2 hours. She said, of course, no problem. She had brought her own camera, a small handheld video camera she had borrowed from her brother, who used it to film his son's youth soccer games. She had practiced operating it until she could do it smoothly without looking at the controls. The moment Vane's car left the driveway, she walked to the bedroom. She sat with Aldous for a few minutes first, talking to him calmly. Then she explained what she was doing and why. She told him she believed he wasn't being cared for properly, that she wanted to document what she was seeing, that she was going to try to get help. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, in a voice that she later described as so flat it was almost without inflection, like a man who had been hoping for something for so long that the hope had worn smooth. "Please hurry." She filmed for 11 minutes. The room, the medication bottles, the food containers, the condition of the bed and the surfaces. And she filmed the detailed physical examination she conducted with her professional training, the assessment of pressure sores, the notation of the medication schedule against what the standard dosage protocols would suggest, the careful cataloging of everything she could observe and measure in the time she had. When Vane's car came back up the driveway, she was seated in the hallway with the clipboard, reviewing the medication schedule as if she'd been there the whole time. The camera was in her bag. He thanked her for her attentiveness and told her the agency would be in touch about future scheduling. The agency called 2 days later and told her that the client had requested a different nurse and they were sorry for the inconvenience. She thanked them and hung up and immediately called the County Adult Protective Services office. Adult Protective Services received Mirabelle Osuji's report on October 2, 2008. She described what she had observed clinically and clearly: a patient whose weight gain was inconsistent with natural progression, a medication schedule that showed signs of recent modification without medical justification, a household environment that had been arranged to minimize the patient's contact with the outside world, and a caregiver who had terminated her involvement the moment she began asking questions. The caseworker who took the report, a woman named Patricia Yuen, noted that Mirabelle was composed and specific. She wasn't emotional about it. She wasn't speculating. She was presenting observations in the ordered way of someone trained to see and document. Patricia Yuen assigned the case a medium priority classification, which, in the resource environment of a County Adult Protective Services office, meant it would be reviewed within 30 days. She noted in the file that a home visit should be scheduled. She also noted the nursing agency's abrupt termination of Mirabelle as a potential indicator of caregiver defensiveness. Then the caseload pressed in around it, the way caseloads do, and 30 days passed. On November 8th, a welfare officer named Dennis Crabb called 41 Calloway Street to schedule a home visit. Vane answered the phone. He was cooperative, warm, and explained that Aldous was having a difficult week health-wise and that a visit in the next few days might be stressful for him. Could they schedule it for the following Monday? Crabb agreed. The following Monday, Vane called and rescheduled again. A minor health crisis, he said. He was very sorry. Crabb rescheduled. And then, on the third attempt, December 9th, 2008, he arrived at the front door of 41 Calloway Street with a colleague and rang the bell. Vane answered, and for the first time in 7 years, someone from the outside world walked into the back bedroom of that house and saw Aldous Fenwick. Dennis Crabb had been a welfare officer for 14 years. He had seen difficult situations. He had seen cases of neglect, of isolation, of exploitation. He had been trained to maintain professional composure and to document rather than react. He later told investigators that when he walked into the back bedroom of 41 Calloway Street, he stood in the doorway for a moment before he could make himself move forward. Aldous Fenwick was lying on a reinforced platform bed that occupied the majority of the room. The window was covered with a heavy blackout curtain. A single lamp in the corner provided the only light. There was a television mounted high on the wall, tuned to a daytime program with the sound very low. The room smelled of antiseptic and something beneath it that Crabb didn't want to name. Aldous was awake. He looked at Crabb and his colleague with an expression that Crabb described in his report as not surprise, more like he was watching something happen that he had stopped being sure would ever happen. Crabb introduced himself. He said he was there to check on Aldous and make sure he was being cared for properly. He asked Aldous how he was doing. Aldous Fenwick looked at him for a long moment. Vane was standing in the doorway behind Crabb, and then Aldous said very quietly, "I'd like to speak to you alone." Vane began to say something about Aldous's confusion, about medication side effects, about how he sometimes said things that weren't quite reliable. Crabb turned and asked Vane to wait in the hallway. Vane complied. The door closed, and Aldous Fenwick, for the first time in 7 years, spoke to someone without Dressler Vane in the room. The conversation between Dennis Crabb and Aldous Fenwick on December 9th, 2008 lasted 42 minutes. Crabb later described it as the most significant conversation of his professional life. Aldous spoke slowly. He said that he had not always understood what was happening to him, that there had been periods, particularly around 2004 and 2005, when he had been so heavily medicated that his memory of those years was fragmentary. But his clarity had improved recently, he said, and in the previous months he had begun to understand the shape of what had been done to him. He knew his money was gone. He had figured that out from fragments of conversation he'd overheard, documents he'd glimpsed when Vane came in to have things signed. He knew his sister thought he had cut contact by choice, because Vane had told him with characteristic gentleness that Patricia was busy with her own life, and that people drift apart, and these things are nobody's fault. He had believed that for a while. Then he had stopped believing it. Then he had simply stopped thinking about it because the alternative, the knowledge that she was out there not knowing what was happening to him, was more than he could carry. He had tried twice to use a phone when Vane was out of the house. Both times he had not been able to reach the phone on the nightstand. Vane had moved it slightly further away each week, so gradually that Aldous hadn't noticed the accumulation of distance until the phone was simply out of reach. He had tried to call out through the window once, in the summer of 2007. Nobody had heard, or nobody had come. He wasn't sure which. He said he had stopped doing those things after a while, not because he stopped wanting to be found, but because the trying and the failing cost something he couldn't afford to keep spending. He had started conserving instead. Conserving his energy, his clarity, the parts of himself that hadn't yet been worn down. He had been waiting in the quiet way that only becomes possible when you've exhausted every active alternative for something to change. That detail, the phone moved an inch at a time, week by week, until it might as well have been in another room, would become one of the most referenced moments in the subsequent investigation. Not because it was the most dramatic element of the case, because it illustrated, more precisely than almost anything else, the nature of the mind they were dealing with. Aldous also said something that Crabb had not been prepared for. He said he wanted to be clear that in the beginning he had not known, that in 2002 and early 2003 he had genuinely believed Vane was a friend helping him through grief, that the weight gain had started as something he'd barely noticed, a man not cooking for himself, eating takeout, sedentary with grief. He didn't want anyone to think he had been foolish. He wanted them to understand that it had been incremental, that by the time he understood what was happening, he had already lost the physical capacity to do anything about it. Dennis Crabb told him, "You don't have to explain yourself to me." Aldous Fenwick said, "I know, but I've been explaining it to myself for 3 years, and I think I just needed to say it to someone else." Crabb's report from the December 9th visit triggered an immediate escalation. Within 48 hours, the Adult Protective Services Office had contacted local law enforcement, who had contacted the district attorney's office. A decision was made that Vane should not be tipped off to the investigation's scope. His cooperation at the welfare visit would be leveraged to keep him calm while investigators worked around him. A court order was obtained on December 15th, authorizing a full financial audit of any accounts connected to Aldous Fenwick's identity or estate. The forensic accountant assigned to the case, a meticulous and methodical woman named Rosa Benedetti, began pulling records the same day. What she found in the first 72 hours was enough to confirm the broad outline of what investigators suspected. What she found over the following weeks was enough to make her, by her own account, genuinely angry in a way she had not felt on a financial case in a decade. The Vane Residential Care Services account was the central hub. Every significant asset from the Fenwick estate had passed through it. The withdrawals were patterned, always in amounts that would not individually trigger reporting requirements, always timed to avoid clustering that might attract automated scrutiny. Benedetti estimated that Vane had spent between 4 and 6 hours per month, every month for 6 years, managing the financial structure of his scheme. It was, she told the prosecuting attorney, a part-time job. He had treated it like one. What made the work particularly grim, Benedetti said in a later interview, was the calendar nature of it. She could reconstruct, month by month, the slow dismantling of a man's financial life. Each transaction was dated. She could see the progression: the retirement account in 2003, the first investment property in 2005, the disability payments from the day they began in 2004. She could see the point at which the savings account dipped below $10,000, below $5,000. And she could see that even after there was almost nothing left, Vane had continued drawing from the disability payments like a salary. $70 here, $140 there, until the end of each month, when whatever had come in had gone out again. He was meticulous, she said, which is the most exhausting kind of fraud to untangle, because nothing is careless. You can't find the mistake. You have to find the pattern, and the pattern is the crime. Parallel to the financial investigation, a court-appointed physician named Dr. Samir Rao was authorized to conduct an independent medical assessment of Aldous Fenwick, to be carried out without Vane's knowledge or presence. Dr. Rao visited the house on December 22, 2008, while Vane was out. He spent 2 hours with Aldous. His report, filed 4 days later, was unambiguous. The pattern of weight gain was inconsistent with any medical condition or behavioral explanation that did not involve deliberate and sustained external caloric provision. Aldous's medication history showed 3 separate periods where sedative compounds had been present at levels above the standard therapeutic range. Periods that corresponded, Benedetti would later confirm, with the timings of the power of attorney signing, the sale of the first investment property, and the initial setup of the Vane Residential Care Services account. He had been sedated for the paperwork. Dr. Rao also documented something that had not been in any prior record: 2 healed rib fractures, inconsistent with any fall or medical event in Aldous's history. The fractures were old, several years. Their origin was never definitively established. Aldous, when carefully asked about them, said he had a vague memory of a night in 2005 when he had been in significant pain, and Vane had told him he had rolled in his sleep and bruised himself. He had no reason to doubt that explanation at the time. He had been heavily medicated. He had believed what he was told. The presence of those fractures, combined with everything else, changed the charge framework prosecutors were considering. The case that had begun as financial exploitation and unlawful imprisonment now carried a physical harm dimension that Clifford Martin would pursue aggressively in the charging document. The fractures could not be attributed to Vane beyond a reasonable doubt as a standalone charge, but they could be brought in under the aggravated assault count as part of a pattern of conduct that demonstrated an intentional and sustained disregard for Aldous Fenwick's physical well-being. They made it into the indictment. They made it to the jury. While the official investigation was building its case through financial records and medical documentation, a separate team of investigators was focused on the evidence Mirabelle Osuji had collected in September of 2008. The 11 minutes of footage she had recorded on her brother's video camera had been turned over to investigators on October 3rd, the day after she filed her initial report. At that point, it had been logged and filed. Useful context, but without the financial and medical evidence to support it, not yet the centerpiece of anything. By January of 2009, it was a different story. The footage was reviewed by the lead investigator on the case, Detective Anita Horowitz, alongside Dr. Rao's medical assessment and Benedetti's financial analysis. What Mirabel had captured, the room, the medications, the physical examination, the food containers visible in the corner, provided a real-time visual record of conditions that the other evidence described only through documents and retrospective testimony. There was one moment in the footage that Horowitz kept returning to. Midway through the 11 minutes, while Mirabel was conducting her physical assessment, Aldous Fenwick turned his head and looked directly at the camera. He didn't say anything. He just looked at it. And in that look, which lasted perhaps 4 seconds, there was something that Horowitz described in a later interview as the expression of a person who has been waiting a very long time for someone to look back. She had watched the clip many times by then. That moment still stopped her every time. By late January of 2009, investigators had enough for an arrest warrant, but the prosecuting attorney, a careful and experienced lawyer named Clifford Martin, wanted more. He wanted the case to be airtight. He wanted to know not just what Vane had done, but why. Whether there was prior history, prior patterns, prior victims. A background investigation into Dressler Vane's history before Millhaven produced results that no one had anticipated. He had lived in 3 previous cities over the preceding 15 years. In each location, investigators found a pattern. A brief period of employment, followed by a close association with an elderly or vulnerable individual, followed by a sudden departure, and the individual's financial situation significantly deteriorated. In the earliest instance, in a city in the Midwest, Vane had worked as a home maintenance contractor and befriended a retired schoolteacher named Hartwell who lived alone. Hartwell had died of natural causes. His nephew, who had inherited the estate, had found the accounts nearly empty and a series of transactions he couldn't explain. He had hired an attorney who had written letters and received responses and eventually been told there was insufficient evidence to pursue. The nephew kept his files. When investigators contacted him in January of 2009, he handed over every document immediately and said he had been waiting for this call for 11 years. In another case, a woman in her 70s had eventually been placed in care by her family, who discovered that her savings were substantially depleted. She had been unable to clearly articulate what had happened. The family had assumed mismanagement, filed a civil claim against the estate of the holding company Vane had used, and received nothing because the company had no assets. They had moved on because they had no choice. None of the previous cases had resulted in criminal charges. The statutes of limitation had run in both jurisdictions. There would be no additional prosecutions. But the pattern confirmed everything that Clifford Martin needed it to confirm. Dressler Vane was not an opportunist who had stumbled into exploitation. He was someone who had refined his method across multiple victims across multiple years. Aldous Fenwick was not his first victim. He was simply the one Vane had gone furthest with, the one who had almost not survived. On February 11, 2009, Detective Anita Horowitz and 3 colleagues arrived at 41 Calloway Street at 7:30 in the morning. Vane opened the door in the casual way of someone who has never had reason to feel threatened by a knock. Then he saw the badges. Then he saw the number of people behind Horowitz. Then, investigators noted, the expression on his face did something they had rarely seen. It went completely still. Not surprised, not frightened. Still, like someone doing a rapid internal calculation. He was placed under arrest in the front doorway of 41 Calloway Street while Aldous Fenwick was in the back bedroom, where he had been for 7 years. An ambulance was already parked 2 streets away, waiting. A specialized medical transport unit was on standby. A team from the county health department was positioned to begin the process of safely removing Aldous from the house, a process that would require modification of the exterior wall to create an opening large enough for the transport equipment. While Vane was being processed in a police vehicle at the curb, Horowitz walked through the house to the back bedroom. She introduced herself to Aldous Fenwick. She told him that Dressler Vane had been arrested and would not be returning to the house. She told him that a medical team was outside and that they were going to take him to a hospital where he would receive proper care. Aldous Fenwick was quiet for a moment. Then he asked one question. "Is my sister going to know?" Horowitz told him yes. They would contact his sister today. He nodded. And then, for the first time in a very long time, Aldous Fenwick closed his eyes and slept without anxiety. The physical extraction of Aldous Fenwick from 41 Calloway Street on the morning of February 11, 2009, was an operation that took 4 hours and required the participation of 9 people, including structural workers, medical personnel, and specialist transport operators. A section of the exterior wall adjacent to the bedroom window had to be removed. The standard doorway, even the widened one Vane had modified years earlier, was not adequate for the transport platform required. The structural work was done carefully and quietly, the way all of it had been done from the moment the first welfare officer stepped into that room, with a kind of deliberate gentleness, as if the people doing the work understood that the man inside had already endured enough abruptness. Neighbors who had gathered on the street watched in silence as the wall came down, and the team worked in coordinated quiet to move a man who had not been outside for 7 years out into the winter morning light. It was cold. The sky was the flat white of February in the Midwest. One of the transport workers later said that when Aldous was moved through the opening in the wall and into the air, he looked up at the sky for a long moment before he looked at anything else. The paramedic team lead, a woman who had been doing emergency medicine for 12 years, told investigators she had to step away for a moment during the transport preparation, not because she was unwell, because she needed 30 seconds that were hers. Margaret Holloway, the neighbor who had stood on that street for years watching the curtains never open, told a journalist afterward that she had stood there in the cold watching and not been able to say anything. "I kept thinking about all the times I'd driven past that house," she said. "All those times I thought about knocking and talked myself out of it. I don't know what I would have done differently, but I've thought about it every day since." Aldous was taken to the regional hospital where he would remain for the next 14 months. His sister, Patricia Fenwick Dade, flew in from Phoenix within 24 hours of being contacted. She sat with him in the hospital room and, according to accounts from the nursing staff, spoke to him for 3 hours without stopping. Nobody wrote down what they said. That's how it should be. The trial preparation throughout 2009 built its case around 3 pillars: the financial records Rosa Benedetti had assembled, Dr. Rao's medical assessment and its implications for deliberate causation, and Mirabelle Osuji's footage from September of 2008. The footage had been mentioned in the pre-trial proceedings, and Vane's defense attorneys had moved to have it excluded, arguing that it had been obtained without proper authorization. The motion was denied. The footage, the judge ruled, had been taken by a licensed nurse performing a professional assessment in a caregiving context. Its content was directly relevant to the charges. It would be admitted. Mirabelle Osuji testified for 3 hours. She explained her observations from her 2 overnight shifts. She explained what she had noticed about the dietary patterns and why they had registered as abnormal to a trained medical professional. She explained the conversation she had with Aldous, during which he had told her he couldn't reach the phone. She explained her decision to record what she had seen and why she had made it. Defense counsel asked her, on cross-examination, whether she had been authorized by any official body to conduct her own private investigation of a client's caregiver. She looked at the attorney for a moment before answering. Then she said, "I was authorized by the man in that room who told me to please hurry." The courtroom was very quiet after that. The footage itself was shown to the jury. The 11 minutes, the room, the medications, the food containers, the physical assessment, and the moment, 4 seconds midway through, where Aldous Fenwick turned his head and looked at the camera. Prosecutors did not narrate that moment. They let it play. Then they paused it. And then they moved on. Dressler Vane testified in his own defense. It was a decision that his attorneys had reportedly argued against, and watching his testimony, it was not difficult to understand why. He was composed, precise. He described his relationship with Aldous as one of genuine care and devotion. He said the weight gain had been distressing to him and that he had tried repeatedly to manage it, that he had contacted a physician in 2006 who had advised dietary changes that he had attempted to implement. When prosecutors asked him to produce any documentation of this physician contact, any name, any record, any receipt, Vane said the doctor had been a private practitioner who worked outside the standard insurance network and that he had paid cash. He had kept no records. He was very sorry for that. He said the financial arrangements had been made at Aldis's direction and that he had simply been following instructions as a trusted agent. He said he had kept meticulous records of every expenditure he had made on Aldis's behalf: food, medication, household maintenance, utility payments. He produced a ledger. Rosa Benedetti, called as a rebuttal witness specifically to address the ledger, spent an hour on the stand methodically demonstrating that the amounts recorded as care expenses accounted for less than a third of the funds that had moved through the Vane Residential Care Services account. The remaining two-thirds had no corresponding expenditure documentation of any kind. He said Mirabelle Osuji had been dismissed because she had been disruptive to the care routine and that her footage was a selective presentation of a context she did not understand. He said this with the same measured confidence with which he had said everything else, and for a moment in that courtroom the air was very still, because that is the particular quality of a very good liar. They make you wonder, just briefly, whether you might be wrong. He was a credible witness in the mechanical sense. His answers were responsive and unflappable. He showed no nervousness, and that, in the end, was part of what convicted him. Clifford Martin, in his cross-examination, walked Vane through the caloric mathematics of Aldis's weight gain year by year. He asked Vane to explain specifically what food had been provided at what intervals to produce those results if the weight gain had been natural. Vane could not answer that question with any precision. Martin asked him to explain the 3 periods of elevated sedative levels in Aldis's medication history and their correlation with the significant financial transactions that had occurred during those same windows. Vane said he couldn't account for every detail of a complex medication regimen over 6 years. Martin asked him about the phone, about the fact that Aldis had told Dennis Crabb he had been unable to reach his phone for months before the welfare visit. He asked Vane to explain how a man whose primary source of connection to the outside world had been rendered unreachable in a room he could not leave had nonetheless been in a position to direct the financial decisions Vane had attributed to him. Vane said Aldis was confused, that his memory wasn't reliable. Martin said, "The phone was on the nightstand on the day of the welfare visit. The welfare officer documented it. Your client could not reach it. Are you saying he was so confused that he couldn't identify an object 12 inches from his hand?" Vane said he had good days and bad days. The jury deliberated for 11 hours. They came back with guilty verdicts on every count. The trial of Dressler Vane concluded in the spring of 2010. Sentencing took place 6 weeks later. Before the judge imposed sentence, Aldis Fenwick's sister, Patricia Fenwick-Dade, read a statement on his behalf. Aldis had wanted to write it himself, she said, but his hands made it difficult. So he had spoken it, and she had written it down. The statement was 2 pages. It did not focus on Vane. It focused on Rosemary, on the marriage they had had, and the life they had built, and what it had meant to lose her. And it said that Dressler Vane had taken something that was already broken and broken it further, and that the question Aldis had spent the year since his rescue asking himself was not about anger, but about what remained. "What remains," the statement read, "is the window. The hospital gave me a room with a window, and I sit beside it every day. That's not nothing. I want whoever is listening to know that it is not nothing." The judge sentenced Dressler Vane to 31 years in federal prison. He was 64 years old at sentencing. He showed no visible reaction. He was led from the courtroom by 2 officers and did not look back. Charges: Dressler Vane. Dressler Vane was convicted on the following counts: elder financial exploitation under state statute, unlawful imprisonment, criminal negligence resulting in serious bodily harm, fraud in obtaining financial control by deception, criminal misuse of power of attorney, and aggravated assault, relating to the unexplained rib fractures documented by Dr. Rao. A separate investigation into his conduct in 2 prior cities resulted in additional civil penalties, but no further criminal charges, as the statutes of limitation had expired in both jurisdictions. Aldous Fenwick remained at the regional hospital for 14 months following his rescue in February of 2009. He underwent multiple medical procedures to address the conditions that had accumulated during his years of enforced immobility. He lost weight slowly, in the careful, medically supervised way that was the only safe approach given his condition. He had setbacks. He had better periods. He was never able to walk unassisted again, but he was able to leave the hospital. In April of 2010, approximately 14 months after the morning the wall of his bedroom was removed to bring him out, Aldous Fenwick was transferred to a residential care facility 20 miles from Millhaven. His sister visited every month. A small group of former colleagues from the freight company, people who had lost touch with him years ago and who had read about the case in the news, began visiting as well. He died on September 3, 2012, of complications from a cardiac event. He was 66 years old. He had spent the last 3 years of his life in a room with a window, in afternoon light, with people who came to see him because they wanted to. In the weeks before he died, he was well enough to dictate a few letters. One went to Dennis Crabb, the welfare officer who had sat with him for 42 minutes and told him he didn't have to explain himself. One went to Dr. Samir Rao. One went to Patricia, and one, which Patricia delivered personally, went to Mirabelle Osuji. Mirabelle has said publicly that she keeps it, but has never shared what it says. That is her right. Some things are for the person they were written to. The obituary his sister wrote was brief and did not mention Dressler Vane. It said that Aldous Fenwick had worked for 30 years in freight logistics, that he had loved his wife, and that he had grown tomatoes badly in the one summer he had tried it. It said he was a patient man who had been through things that required a great deal of patience and had not been broken by them. It said he would be missed. Mirabelle Osuji left the home care agency in 2010 and transitioned into hospital-based nursing. She continued working as an LPN for years afterward. She has spoken about the case in a small number of interviews and has consistently declined to describe herself as a hero or a whistleblower. She says she did what her training told her to do and what basic decency required. In 2011, she testified before a state legislative committee reviewing protocols for home care workers encountering suspected abuse. Her testimony contributed to a revision of reporting guidelines that required home care agencies to implement formal training for workers on identifying financial and physical exploitation of vulnerable adults, and created a protected reporting pathway that shielded contract nurses from retaliation for filing concerns about clients' caregivers. The revision also required that home care agencies conduct independent welfare checks on clients whenever a contract worker is abruptly terminated within the first month of service, a direct response to what had happened when Vane dismissed Mirabelle and the agencies simply reassigned her without asking why. That specific provision, which critics of the original bill had called overly burdensome, passed on its third attempt after Mirabelle Osuji testified about what a single follow-up call might have meant for Aldous Fenwick in September of 2008. The bill passed with broad support. It was signed into law quietly, without ceremony, the way most important things are. When Mirabelle was asked by a journalist what she thought about most from the case, she said it wasn't the footage or the trial or any of the things that had happened afterward. It was the moment in that dim bedroom in September of 2008 when she had looked at Aldous Fenwick and he had said, "Please hurry." He said it like he knew exactly how much time he had left, she said, like he'd been counting it. And I thought, nobody should have to count like that. Nobody should have to spend their life counting. For Aldous Fenwick, who sat beside a window and knew it was not nothing, and for the nurse who came back,